Moral debt. How money shaped what we believe about goodness, power, and worth. Back cover description. What if the real problem isn't money, but what we've come to believe it's worth? In Moral Debt, a carpenter-turned-thinker takes a bold, clear-eyed look at the moral history of money, from ancient religious laws to modern banking, from medieval debt to billionaire worship. With honesty, humility, and deep curiosity, this book asks the question economists often forget. Is this system even right? Drawing from the Bible, Torah, Quran, and real-world stories, Moral Debt traces how we lost the soul of money, and how we might get it back. It uncovers how debt became shame, how wealth became righteousness, and how we've built a world where dignity costs too much. Perfect for readers of all faiths, or none, this book is part history, part manifesto, and part blueprint for a more humane economy, one built not on domination, but on contribution, belonging, and trust. If you've ever worked hard and still felt behind, this book is for you. If you've ever wondered why the rich sleep easy while others drown in debt, this book is for you. If you've ever thought, maybe we could build this better, this book is for all of us. Chapter 1, The Carpenter's Question. Is this money good? I never thought I'd write a book about money. I'm not a banker. I'm not a professor. I'm not someone who owns 10 properties or trades stocks or posts motivational quotes about grind culture. I'm a carpenter. I work with my hands. I build things. I fix things. I go home tired and sometimes broke, but I sleep all right because I know I did something real that day. But over the years a question kept following me around, in job sites, grocery lines, churches, and even late-night conversations with strangers. It was simple but stubborn. Is this system right? Is money moral? Or did we build our whole world on something that doesn't care if we live or die? It hit me hardest one day after work, when a younger guy I was training looked at his paycheck and asked, "How are we supposed to live off this?" I didn't have an answer. Not a good one, anyway. So instead, I asked a different question. Do you think money is good? He laughed. Not a cruel laugh, more like a tired one. He said, "I think money doesn't care." And that stuck with me. Work without dignity. When I was a kid, I was told that if you worked hard, paid your dues, showed up on time, you'd be okay. You'd get a house, maybe raise a family, maybe retire someday with a little pride. But that equation doesn't add up anymore. It's not just wages that feel off, it's the feeling behind them. You can work 10-hour days and still feel broke. You can do everything right and still feel behind. Meanwhile, you look around and see others, maybe people who manipulate systems, or make money from money, living better, sleeping easier, and somehow being praised for their hustle. It makes a man wonder, what's the game here? And who made the rules? When did money become a god? Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking if our money was good. Not is it real, not is it legal, but is it good in the moral sense? Is it just? Is it fair? Does it uplift? Does it serve us, or do we serve it? Religions used to talk about this stuff all the time. Christian monks wrote about the sin of usury. Jewish law had debt forgiveness built into the calendar. Islam outright forbids interest. Even ancient tribal cultures had rules about sharing abundance and limiting hoarding. But today, try talking about interest rates as a moral issue and people look at you like you're from another planet. Try saying billionaires are a symptom of moral decay, not success, and you'll be told you just don't get economics. Maybe I don't. But maybe the economists don't get people. Why a carpenter is writing this. When you build something, a house, a table, a set of stairs, you don't just care about speed. You care about structure. About safety. About the human lives that will move through that thing every day. What if we looked at money that way? What if we saw money not as a fuel or a scoreboard, but as a structure that shapes lives? A thing we all move through, sleep under, trip over, and sometimes get crushed by. Then maybe the right question isn't, how do we get more of it, but how do we build it better? That's what this book is about. Not as economists. Not as politicians. But as people. Workers. Citizens. Neighbors. Believers in something more human than compound interest. So no, I'm not here to explain inflation charts or crypto tokens. I'm just here to ask the question I think most of us carry quietly. Is this how it's supposed to work? And if not, what would it take to build something worthy of us all? Absolutely. Here's Chapter 2. What is Here's Chapter 9, Billionaires and the Broken Scale, a candid look at extreme wealth, moral imbalance, and what happens when the scale tips too far. Chapter 2. What is money, really? The story we all live inside, but never question. Most people don't think about money unless they don't have enough of it. And when you do not have enough, you're not pondering its meaning, you're hustling, surviving, cutting corners, or sitting in quiet panic while rent or groceries hang in the balance. Money becomes pressure, not philosophy. But if we want to ask whether this system is right, we have to start with something basic, something so obvious that most people miss it entirely. What is money? Not what it does. Not how to get it. But what it is at its core. 1. Money isn't real, not in the way you think. Money isn't gold. Money isn't paper. Money isn't even digital numbers in a bank account. Money is a story. A shared agreement. A collective fiction that everyone chooses to believe because, well, it works. Try this. Imagine handing someone a piece of bark from a tree and asking for a loaf of bread in return. They'd laugh. But hand them a plastic debit card or a $10 bill with a government stamp, and it's accepted, not because it has inherent value, but because we've agreed it means something. At its core, money is trust. Nothing more. Nothing less. 2. From cows to coins to credit. The history of money is actually the history of how humans learned to scale trust. Long ago, people bartered, goats for grain, bread for labor, etc. But barter was clunky. What if the person didn't want what you had? So humans invented things to represent value: shells, stones, beads, metal coins. Eventually, this turned into government-issued currency, stamped with kings' faces or religious symbols to say, this is real. This is worth something. Trust it. Then came paper money. Then digital numbers. Then credit, money you don't have yet but promise to repay later. Trust on top of trust. Now we live in a world where most money doesn't exist physically at all. It's digital, speculative, imaginary, and yet it rules almost every decision we make. 3. Money isn't just about math. We've been told money is logical. That it's clean. That the market doesn't care about feelings, just numbers. But here's the truth. Money is emotional. Ask anyone drowning in debt how they feel about money. Ask a parent who can't afford medicine. Ask a worker who can't sleep because their rent is due in 2 days and their paycheck is 5 days away. Money touches everything sacred. Our homes. Our health. Our hopes. Our futures. Which means, money is moral. Whether we admit it or not. 4. The moral blind spot. If money is built on trust, and money controls our access to survival, then shouldn't we ask whether it's being used in ways that are ethical? Who gets to control how money flows? Why do some people get to create it, lend it, hoard it, while others live in scarcity? We don't ask these questions often enough because we've been trained to believe money is neutral, it's just a tool. But so is a hammer. And if someone keeps using a hammer to hurt others, eventually we say, maybe it's not just the tool, maybe it's how we're allowing it to be used. This book isn't anti-money. It's anti-cruelty, anti-confusion, anti-shame. It's about taking back the narrative and asking, what if money could work differently? 5. Reframing the question. So again, what is money? Maybe it's not an object but a question itself. How much do we trust each other? How much do we believe in contribution? How much do we value life over leverage? If money is just a story, then it can be rewritten. If it's a system, then it can be rebuilt. If it's a structure, then let's check if it still stands on solid ground. Because if something's hurting people, making them feel invisible or ashamed, it's not just a technical issue, it's a moral one. Chapter 3. The Sin of Usury. Why lending money for profit was once considered a sin. There was a time, not too long ago in the grand sweep of history, when charging interest on a loan wasn't just controversial. It was considered a sin. Not a business strategy. Not a sign of financial intelligence. Not how the system works. A sin, one that could stain your soul and displease God. This was the belief in much of Europe for over 1,000 years. And yet today, the idea sounds absurd to most people. After all, how could a modern economy work without interest? But that's the point. Maybe it shouldn't. 1. What is usury? Usury simply means lending money at interest. Today, the word usually refers to excessive interest. But historically, especially in Christian theology, any interest was seen as usury. Why? Because money was considered barren. It didn't produce anything on its own. It had no natural yield. If you lent someone 10 coins and they gave you back 12, you were profiting without working, and at the borrower's expense. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. Deuteronomy 23 verse 19. The act of making money from money was seen as immoral, especially when it preyed on the poor or desperate. 2. Christian teachings on usury. The early church didn't just dislike usury, it condemned it outright. St. Thomas Aquinas called it unjust and unnatural. The Council of Nicaea banned clergy from engaging in it. Pope Alexander III said usurers should be denied Christian burial. In fact, for most of the Middle Ages, Christians were forbidden by canon law from lending money at interest. Doing so was seen as exploitation, not enterprise. The Church's logic was spiritual and social. Lending should be done out of charity, not profit. The poor should be helped, not burdened. Wealth should be shared, not hoarded. These weren't fringe ideas, they were mainstream doctrine. 3. The Jewish role in medieval lending. Here's where things got complicated and dangerous. Because Jews weren't bound by Christian canon law, they could legally lend money with interest. And because they were barred from owning land, entering many trades, or joining guilds, moneylending became one of the few professions available. So Jews became lenders, not out of greed, but because the system pushed them into that role. Over time, Christian kings, nobles, and even the church borrowed from Jewish lenders and resented them for it. When debts piled up, rulers often expelled Jewish communities, seized their assets, and cancelled what they owed. This led to centuries of anti-Semitic myths and stereotypes, the image of the greedy Jew, the moneylender, the outsider profiting off the community. Myths that still echo dangerously today. But the truth is more sobering. Jewish moneylending existed because Christian power needed credit, but refused to provide it morally. 4. Why it was considered a sin. At its heart, the Church's ban on usury wasn't just about money. It was about relationships. To charge interest was to profit off another's need, to turn their struggle into your gain. It meant helping the poor only if they paid you more. Lending a hand with one hand in their pocket. Turning love of neighbor into a transaction. The church asked a bold question. What does money do to the soul? And when they saw interest hardening hearts, widening gaps, and reducing mercy to math, they said, enough. 5. What changed? So why did everything shift? A few reasons. As trade expanded, credit became essential. Banks in Venice, Florence, and Amsterdam found clever workarounds. Protestant reformers, especially Calvinists, saw wealth as a sign of God's favor, not moral danger. Eventually, usury bans softened, then vanished. The result? A global system where interest is normal, expected, and even glorified, even if it drives people into debt, shame, or despair. 6. What we lost. By removing the moral lens, we stopped asking the real questions. Should everyone be allowed to charge interest? Should the poor pay more to be poor? Is money serving life, or extracting from it? In the old world, usury was a soul issue. In the new world, it's just business. But maybe it's time to ask again. What kind of world are we building, when mercy costs more than money? Chapter 4. The Jewish Exception. How systemic exclusion shaped moneylending, and how myth distorted its meaning. When most people hear Jewish moneylender, they hear a stereotype. When I tell you the real story, I hope you feel grief, and also understanding of how systems force people into unlikely roles. 1. Exclusion and opportunity. In medieval Europe, Jews were often barred from land ownership, many trades, guild membership, and public office. They lived in a world of legal limits. Meanwhile, Christian doctrine forbade Christians from lending with interest, usury, at least in many territories and periods. The result, economic demand for credit existed, but Christian lenders often could not serve it without ecclesiastical backlash. Jews, as religious minorities, were not bound by Christian canon law. So in many places, they filled the credit void, lending money, serving merchants, financing projects. So yes, sometimes, Jewish communities became prominent in moneylending, not because they preferred it, but because the system left them few options. 2. Contracts, credit, and legal protections. Lending in the medieval world was risky. You needed legal enforceability, courts to enforce contracts. Some property or collateral, often land, goods, or pledges. Reputation and networks. Jewish lenders often used many safeguards. Written contracts. Witnesses. Collateral, goods, land rights, future income. Letters of credit, trade networks. Because they were minorities, they had to be precise and legally rigorous to avoid disputes, persecution, or accusations. 3. Resentment, power, and expulsions. Because lending often involved Christian borrowers, nobles, monarchs, merchants, resentment built. Debtors didn't like creditors. Rulers borrowed heavily, then penalized their lenders when they lacked ability or will to repay. Anti-Semitic tropes painted Jewish lenders as greedy exploiters, even when they were fulfilling necessary economic functions. Expulsions were a way to cancel debts, seize assets, and consolidate power, disguised as moral or religious purging. Examples. England, 1290, King Edward I expelled Jews, cancelled debts owed to them, and seized their properties. France and Spain had repeated expulsions, often intertwined with reconquest, religious zeal, and debt politics. 4. Myth versus reality, breaking the stereotype. The stereotype of the Jewish banker is powerful and false in many ways. Reality. Most medieval Jews were not bankers. Many were tailors, scribes, scholars, artisans. Lending was risky, low margin, and socially fraught, not always lucrative. Many Jewish communities themselves were vulnerable to debt, poverty, and persecution. Stereotypes of greed ignored centuries of vulnerability, displacement, and legal oppression. Myth made coercion look like choice. Myth made victimhood look like power. Myth erased the real constraints. 5. What this teaches us today. When people are excluded, they adapt. When systems forbid avenues, new ones emerge, sometimes with moral complexity. If we want a more just economy, we must remember how constraints shape outcomes. We should resist moralizing those who operate under force. We must demand systems built with dignity, not exclusion. Closing reflection. The story of Jewish moneylenders isn't a story of inherent virtue or vice. It's a story of dispossessed people navigating a world that restricted them, and doing what they had to in imperfect conditions. Accusation without context is cruelty. Understanding without justification is justice. As we work toward a new economy, we carry this lesson. Before we judge roles, let's change the rules. Chapter 5. The Rise of the Bankers. When money stopped being a relationship and became a system. In the last chapter, we saw how lending used to be deeply moralized, viewed through the lens of charity, power, and religious duty. But as cities grew, trade expanded, and empires needed financing, something shifted. What began as a spiritual warning slowly became an economic necessity. And so emerged a new kind of figure in society. The banker. Not a priest. Not a merchant. Not a ruler. But a new kind of middleman, one who didn't just move goods, but moved trust. And as the banker rose, the soul of money began to disappear. 1. From temples to trade halls. In ancient societies, money was often tied to temples. Giving, sharing, and even forgiving debts were spiritual acts. But in medieval Italy, especially in Venice, Florence, and Genoa, merchant families began building new systems. They invented bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, merchant banks. These tools allowed them to lend across borders, track complex debts, and scale credit without carrying gold. Suddenly, lending wasn't just tolerated, it became essential to trade. The Medici family in Florence used banking to build an empire, funding art, war, and even popes. And other families followed suit. 2. Why the rules started to change. As economic power shifted from church to capital, moral arguments lost ground to market logic. Lending was no longer seen as an act of greed but of innovation. The Protestant Reformation helped too. Reformers like John Calvin believed that wealth could show God's blessing, and interest could be charged ethically, if it wasn't exploitative. Now, charging interest didn't stain your soul, it strengthened your bank. The soul was being slowly replaced by the spreadsheet. 3. The institutionalization of profit. With interest normalized, money became a product. You didn't just lend to help. You lent to grow. You lent to make money off other people's money. Banks began creating financial instruments, not just holding deposits, but lending credit, buying and selling debt, speculating on futures. We stopped asking, should we do this? And started asking, can we profit from this? Banking became less about humans and more about mechanisms. 4. What got lost? The rise of the banker brought efficiency, expansion, globalization, innovation. But it also brought abstraction. Money lost its human face. Distance, lenders no longer knew the borrowers. Detachment, responsibility faded into systems. Before, if you hurt someone with a loan, they were your neighbor. Now they were a line in your ledger. Money became colder, and the system preferred it that way. 5. The double standard. It's worth noting, many of the bankers who rose in this era were Christian, even though usury had only recently been a mortal sin. Meanwhile, Jews were still blamed and hated for being moneylenders, even as Christian banks expanded global finance. So the stigma remained for Jews, but the profits moved to Christian Europe. This hypocrisy shaped centuries of myth and policy, some of which still echo in our unconscious narratives today. 6. Bankers and the modern mind. As banks grew more powerful, they became invisible architects of society. They funded kings and wars. They shaped colonial trade. They picked winners and losers. Yet most people couldn't explain how banks worked, even as their lives were governed by loans, fees, interest, and credit. The banker no longer sat in a shop on the corner. The banker became a system. Final thought. There was a time when lending was a question of character. Now it's a question of code. That's not all bad, modern economies need credit to function. But we should ask. Is the banker still a person? Or just a profit machine? Is the system serving people, or just perpetuating itself? Because somewhere in the rise of the banker, we stopped asking whether money was moral. And maybe it's time we asked again. Chapter 6. Capitalism and Conscience. When profit became a virtue and poverty a personal failure. By the time the industrial age arrived, money wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Once, Christians saw wealth as spiritually dangerous. Now people started seeing it as a sign of discipline, intelligence, or even divine favor. This wasn't a small cultural shift. It was a complete moral reversal. And it paved the way for capitalism, not just as an economic system but as a belief system. A religion with no God, no temple, and only one commandment. Grow. 1. The Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. In 1905, German sociologist Max Weber wrote one of the most important books in history. It was called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber argued that certain Protestant values, especially Calvinist ones, laid the moral foundation for capitalism. Thrift. Hard work. Discipline. Delayed gratification. But more than that, Calvinists believed in predestination. That meant if you were chosen, your life would show signs, like wealth, health, or success. Over time, this turned into something much darker. If you're rich, you must be good. If you're poor, maybe you deserve it. This moral framing, that profit was virtue, shaped entire nations. 2. Capitalism as creed. With industrialization came factories, mass production, labor forces, urban poverty. Capitalism emerged as a system that could organize work, reward innovation, create wealth at scale. But here's the catch. Capitalism isn't just a machine, it's a moral mirror. It rewards what it values and ignores what it doesn't. It rewards output, not effort. Ownership, not contribution. Productivity, not dignity. Over time, capitalism stopped being one option among many, and started presenting itself as the only rational system. To question it became unpatriotic. To doubt it became naive. 3. The shame of the poor. Under capitalism, poverty became a character flaw. If you're broke, you didn't hustle hard enough. If you're in debt, you made poor choices. If you're struggling, it's your fault, not the system's. This mindset, still deeply embedded in Western culture, disconnects struggle from context. It ignores wage stagnation, discrimination, healthcare costs, generational poverty, predatory lending. It turns systemic problems into personal guilt. And it makes people suffer alone, instead of organizing together. 4. Can capitalism have a conscience? Capitalism isn't inherently evil. It has created innovation, mobility, and opportunities for millions. But without conscience, it becomes cruel. It needs guardrails, laws and ethics, redistribution, taxes, services, accountability, labor rights, anti-corruption, humility, knowing it's a system, not a savior. What it does not need is worship, dogma, blind faith. Capitalism is a tool, a powerful one. But when tools start shaping morals, we build worlds where profit matters more than people. 5. Returning to the carpenter's question. So let's come back to the question I asked at the beginning. Is this system right? Can we look at a world where billionaires launch rockets for fun, while families ration insulin to survive, and still say, yes, this is working? Or can we say, maybe we need a different kind of wealth? One that measures compassion, creativity, contribution, care. One that doesn't confuse value with valuation. Final thought. Capitalism taught us that money proves worth. But some of the best people I've known never had much of it. So maybe the real revolution isn't in overthrowing capitalism. Maybe it's in redefining what success even means. Chapter 7. The invention of credit score.